My name is Coco Parker, 32 years old, and senior controller at Techvision Enterprises. For 8 years, I've lived comfortably in spreadsheets and balance sheets while avoiding office politics. Numbers never lie, even when people do. When our CEO announced the merger with Innosphere Technologies, everyone celebrated, but his numbers never quite added up in my books. I just never expected my attention to detail would expose a multi-million-dollar fraud that would bring down the entire executive team. Before I dive into this wild corporate roller coaster, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about standing up for what is right even when it feels impossible. I graduated from the University of Michigan with dual degrees in accounting and finance. Techvision recruited me straight out of college, impressed by my analytical skills and attention to detail. That was 8 years ago. Since then, I had built a reputation as someone methodical and reliable. The person who could find the misplaced decimal point that explained a $10,000 discrepancy. The controller who caught patterns others missed. Despite my skills, promotions came slowly. I watched as others with more charisma but less technical ability climbed past me. My boss once told me, "Coco, you need to be more visible." I never quite understood what that meant. I let my work speak for itself. Maybe that was my first mistake. My apartment was modest compared to what some executives lived in. A one-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy. I drove a 6-year-old Honda, while our CEO, Brandon Wells, arrived each morning in his custom Tesla. I brought homemade lunches while executives expensed daily outings at 5-star restaurants. But I never minded. I found satisfaction in living within my means and saving for my future. Techvision occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in the financial district. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic city views. The reception area featured a digital wall displaying real-time data visualizations that impressed visitors but told them nothing substantive about our business. Style over substance was our unspoken motto. The company threw lavish parties quarterly. The summer gala at the Botanical Gardens, the holiday extravaganza at the Art Museum, the spring mixer on a yacht, the fall festival at a vineyard. Always open bars, always gourmet food, always speeches about how we were disrupting the industry and changing the game. These events were mandatory team building, though they felt more like opportunities for executives to network, while the rest of us served as background characters. Our sales department operated under immense pressure. Quotas increased every quarter regardless of market conditions. Those who met them received champagne deliveries to their desks. Those who missed them quietly disappeared within weeks. The finance department where I worked was viewed as the necessary evil. The people who said no. The fun police who questioned expenses and demanded receipts. The executive floor was a different world from where regular employees worked. They had private offices with actual doors while we had open plan desks. They had a separate kitchen stocked with premium coffee and fresh fruit. They had an executive bathroom with fancy hand soap and real towels. Small things that added up to a clear message: they were different from us. Brandon Wells became CEO at 35 after a meteoric rise from outside consultant to C-suite. His Harvard MBA and inclusion on 30 under 30 lists gave him instant credibility. He could mesmerize a room with vision statements and future forecasts. Investors loved him. He drove the Tesla I mentioned, lived in a waterfront condo, and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. I initially respected Brandon. He seemed to understand the industry and had ambitious growth plans. He remembered employee names and sent personal notes for work anniversaries. When my team completed a complex audit, he sent us all gift baskets. It felt good to be acknowledged. I interpreted his generosity as appreciation rather than manipulation. I was wrong. Our CFO, Marcus Campbell, had been Brandon's fraternity brother at Harvard. He had the same polished appearance and confident manner, but none of the strategic thinking. Marcus relied on his team to generate insights which he presented as his own. He treated finance as a necessary stepping stone to a more prestigious role. Numbers bored him, power excited him. Heather Mitchell ran our HR department and became my closest friend at Techvision. Unlike many executives, she came from a working-class background and never forgot it. She navigated politics skillfully, but privately rolled her eyes at corporate theatrics. When things got stressful, we would meet for coffee, and she would share her unfiltered observations about the executive team. I cherished her authenticity in a culture built on appearance. My finance team consisted of Rachel Wilson, a junior controller fresh from graduate school, and Jason Carter in accounts payable. Rachel was brilliant but nervous around authority figures. Jason was dependable but uninspired, doing exactly what was required and nothing more. Together we kept the financial machinery running smoothly, processing payroll, managing expenses, preparing statements, and ensuring compliance. The merger announcement came during an all-hands meeting on a Tuesday morning. Everyone gathered in the atrium as Brandon took the stage with his trademark confidence. "Today marks the beginning of an extraordinary new chapter," he proclaimed. "Our merger with Innosphere Technologies will create synergies that disrupt the entire market landscape." The stock price jumped 15% by noon. Brandon promised bonuses, growth opportunities, and exciting challenges. The company buzzed with optimism. Even I felt it. A merger meant new systems to integrate, new processes to develop, new financial structures to build. It would be complex, demanding work that played to my strengths. I was assigned to prepare the financial documents for due diligence. That meant compiling years of statements, expense reports, revenue projections, and tax filings. As I assembled these materials, I noticed small discrepancies. Revenue growth slightly higher than market conditions would suggest. Expenses categorized in ways that maximize tax advantages. Nothing overtly illegal, but together they painted a picture slightly rosier than reality. Eleanor Fitzgerald was the only board member who consistently asked challenging questions. In her 70s, with a lifetime of business experience, she had a reputation for integrity that survived decades in corporate America. During the merger announcement, while other board members beamed, she watched Brandon with an appraising gaze. Later, when I briefed the board on financial readiness, she asked me pointed questions about cash reserves that made Brandon visibly uncomfortable. I should have recognized the significance of her concerns sooner. The weeks following the announcement were a flurry of activity. Teams formed to handle different aspects of the merger. Legal reviewed contracts. HR planned for potential redundancies. It prepared for systems integration. And finance, my department, prepared for the comprehensive audit that would determine if the deal proceeded. Brandon emphasized the importance of putting our best foot forward and showcasing our strengths. In retrospect, his anxiety should have been a warning. The merger process began with a formal timeline. 6 weeks for preliminary due diligence, 4 weeks for integration planning, 2 weeks for final negotiations. Then, closing. It seemed reasonable on paper, but immediately created a pressure cooker environment. Everyone worked late, ordered dinner to their desks, and canceled personal plans. The message was clear: nothing mattered except the merger. I was appointed as the liaison to the financial audit team from Innosphere. This meant preparing documentation, answering questions, and explaining any unusual items they might find. Brandon personally informed me of this assignment, emphasizing how my attention to detail made me perfect for the role. At the time, I felt flattered. Later, I realized he had wanted someone cautious who would check with leadership before answering difficult questions. The executive team reviewed all documentation before it went to the auditors. Standard procedure, Marcus assured me. They requested multiple revisions to how information was presented. Nothing technically false, but always framed to emphasize strengths and minimize weaknesses. Late one night, as I revised a cash flow statement for the third time, I questioned why we were massaging the presentation if we had nothing to hide. But I dismissed the thought, assuming this was normal merger posturing. The audit team arrived on a Monday morning. 5 people led by Richard Thompson, a senior partner at their accounting firm. He was tall, serious, and methodical. With reading glasses he peered over when asking questions. His team took over our small conference room, lining the walls with banker boxes full of documents. They requested high security access to our financial systems, which made our IT department nervous. Brandon insisted on greeting them personally, bringing coffee and pastries to their temporary office. He made small talk about golf and vacation properties. Too friendly for what should have been an adversarial process. I noticed Richard remained professionally distant, despite Brandon's charm offensive. The first week passed uneventfully. The audit team requested documents, interviewed department heads, and explored our systems. Their questions seemed standard. Then came the first hint of trouble during a preliminary review meeting. "We have questions about your revenue recognition policies," Richard said, referencing a specific client contract. The milestone payments seemed recorded before the deliverables were completed. Brandon jumped in before I could answer. That project had a unique timeline. The client actually requested early billing for their fiscal year purposes. He smiled confidently. "We have documentation if you need it." Richard nodded but made a note. I knew we had no such documentation but kept silent. Later I checked the contract in question. Brandon had lied. We had indeed recorded revenue too early, artificially inflating our quarterly results. The next day they questioned our cash reserves. "Your statement shows $26 million in operating cash, but our system access shows $23.4 million. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Again, Brandon intercepted. "Timing difference. We had a major client payment that was in transit during the statement preparation." Another lie. I had prepared those statements. There was no payment in transit. After each meeting, Brandon and Marcus would exchange glances. Silent communication that excluded everyone else. I began watching more carefully, noting when it happened and what triggered it. Heather caught me in the break room one afternoon. "Brandon seems off lately," she said quietly. "Have you noticed?" He snapped at his assistant for scheduling a lunch 15 minutes too early. Not his usual calculated self. I nodded but said nothing. Company loyalty still outweighed my growing concerns. That loyalty would cost me dearly. 2 weeks into the process, we had a scheduled review meeting with the full audit team. They had compiled their preliminary findings, and the conference room was tense before they even began speaking. Brandon kept checking his phone. Marcus straightened his tie repeatedly. I reviewed my notes, prepared to explain any discrepancies they might have found. Richard opened with areas where everything aligned properly. Standard auditor approach, start with the positive. Then he shifted. "We have identified inconsistencies in your expense accounts that require clarification." He displayed a spreadsheet showing executive expenses over the past 3 years. "There is an unusual pattern of round number charges from restaurants. Always even amounts. $500, $1,000, $2,000. No restaurant bills end in such round figures once tax and tip are applied." The room fell silent. I glanced at my own notes, confused. I processed expense reports but had never noticed this pattern. Brandon's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. You are nitpicking receipts instead of focusing on the big picture of this merger." Richard remained calm. "Financial integrity is the big picture, Mr. Wells." Brandon stood suddenly, his chair rolling backward. "This is 1950s accounting examining lunch receipts, while we are creating a billion-dollar enterprise." His voice echoed against the glass walls. "This is clearly a failure of our finance department to properly document legitimate business expenses." All eyes turned to me, the controller responsible for expense oversight. Brandon had redirected blame directly to my department. My face burned with humiliation and confusion. I had processed the expenses exactly as approved by Marcus and Brandon. Had I missed something obvious? The meeting ended abruptly after Brandon's outburst. As people filed out, Richard made brief eye contact with me. His expression was unreadable, but he held my gaze a beat longer than necessary. He suspected something beyond poor documentation. That evening, I questioned my entire team. Rachel insisted all procedures had been followed correctly. "We flag unusual expenses. The CFO approves executive charges regardless of our flags. Standard procedure." Jason confirmed the same process for his accounts payable work, everything processed according to established protocols. Marcus visited my office the next morning. He closed the door, something he never did. "Brandon is under tremendous pressure to make this merger happen," he said, perching on the edge of my desk uninvited. "The board has tied his compensation package to completion. We need team players right now, Coco." He smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "You are a team player, right?" The implied threat hung in the air between us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. After he left, I sat motionless, my mind racing. That night, I barely slept, mental spreadsheets and conversations replaying in endless loops. By dawn, I had made a decision. I would personally verify everything. No more accepting explanations at face value. If something was wrong, I needed to know exactly what. I began staying late at the office long after most employees had gone home. With the audit team gone by 6, I had privacy to conduct my own investigation. I ordered dinner delivery and told my friends I was working on a personal project. Not entirely false. First, I reviewed all executive expense reports for the past 3 years. Thousands of transactions. I created my own database to track patterns, something that would have been flagged had I done it during normal hours on the company system. Night after night, I populated my spreadsheet with dates, amounts, vendors, and approvers. The pattern emerged clearly. Brandon and several other executives regularly submitted lunch receipts with suspiciously round numbers. Always from the same 10 restaurants. Always approved by Marcus without question. Some weeks showed lunch expenses nearly every day, totaling thousands of dollars monthly. I expanded my investigation, cross-referencing dates with our security system. On multiple occasions, Brandon had submitted lunch receipts for meetings when building records showed he never left the office. On others, the receipt timestamps conflicted with meetings I knew he had attended. The discrepancies multiplied the deeper I dug. I needed to understand how these receipts entered our system. Most employees submitted digital copies through our expense portal, but executives had a separate process, their assistants handling the paperwork. I arranged coffee with Lisa, Brandon's executive assistant, under the pretense of streamlining the expense process. Brandon has very specific instructions about his receipts, Lisa told me, glancing around the cafe nervously. He gives me the vendor names and amounts. I create the appropriate documentation and file it under the categories he specifies. He gives you the information rather than the actual receipts. Lisa nodded. All the executives do it that way. Their time is too valuable to track receipts. She leaned forward. Is there a problem? Marcus assured me this was approved protocol. I smiled reassuringly. Just trying to understand the different workflows. No problem at all. But there was a massive problem. Lisa was unknowingly creating fraudulent documentation at Brandon's direction. I began connecting my observations with other patterns. Brandon had purchased a vacation property shortly after closing our largest client deal. He began wearing designer watches after our IPO. His new sports car arrived weeks after a major product launch. His lifestyle consistently exceeded what his substantial but not unlimited salary should support. One night I calculated rough estimates. Brandon's annual compensation package totaled about $2 million, generous by any standard. But his visible expenses suggested spending of nearly $4 million annually. The math simply did not work unless he had family money or another income source. According to his company biography, he came from a middle-class background and worked his way through college. I was 3 weeks into my investigation when Marcus caught me. The office had emptied hours earlier, but he returned unexpectedly. He found me reviewing executive expense categories in our financial system. Working late again, Coco. His tone was light, but his expression was hard. Anything I can help with? I closed the screen as casually as possible. Just preparing for the next audit session. They have been asking detailed questions. Marcus placed both hands on my desk, leaning forward. Executive expenses are pre-approved and not your concern. The audit team will direct any questions to me. His hand moved to my shoulder, resting there with uncomfortable weight. The merger is too important for distractions. I would hate for Brandon to think you are creating problems rather than solving them. After he left, I copied my findings to a secure personal drive and removed all traces from my work computer. The threat was unmistakable. My career, possibly more, was at risk. I needed advice from someone I trusted. The next day, I asked Heather to meet for lunch off-site. We found a quiet corner in a restaurant 10 blocks from the office. After swearing her to secrecy, I outlined what I had discovered. You understand what you are suggesting? Heather asked, her food untouched. Brandon has the board wrapped around his finger. Marcus controls the financial approval process, if they are working together to misappropriate funds. I know how it sounds, I admitted, but the numbers do not lie. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Heather outlined my options. Report to the audit committee, though Brandon had allies there. Contact the SEC as a whistleblower, though that would effectively end my career at Techvision. Or document everything but stay quiet until the audit team discovered it independently. You need to understand the personal cost, Heather warned. Whistleblowers rarely come out ahead even when they are right. The company will paint you as disgruntled or incompetent. Your future job prospects could be affected. I pushed my salad around my plate. What about the cost of staying silent? Letting them continue. Being complicit. Heather reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Document everything. Protect yourself. But be very careful who you trust with this information. Her eyes met mine, including me. I will support you, but my position puts me in a difficult situation as well. I decided to continue gathering evidence while watching how the audit progressed. If the team discovered the issues independently, I would confirm their findings. If they missed it, I would have to make the difficult decision to come forward directly. The audit intensified as we entered the third week. The team practically lived in our conference room, arriving before most employees and staying until security did final rounds. They requested additional documentation daily. Historical statements going back 5 years. Vendor contracts. Board meeting minutes. Client communications. Their questions became increasingly specific. Brandon began checking in with the audit team multiple times daily. Casual visits that were obviously surveillance. Just seeing if you need anything, he would say, eyes scanning their documents. Richard remained professional but increasingly reserved. The pressure affected everyone. The development team had to justify their project timelines. Sales scrambled to explain client acquisition costs. Marketing defended their campaign metrics. All normal in an audit, but Brandon turned each request into a referendum on departments meeting merger expectations. His behavior grew erratic. He canceled important client meetings without explanation. Minor issues triggered disproportionate reactions. Once calm and calculated, he now snapped at presenters during meetings and sent late-night emails questioning department decisions. One afternoon, the entire executive floor heard him shouting at Marcus behind closed doors. We couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. When Marcus emerged, his complexion was ashen, and his hands visibly trembled. He canceled his remaining meetings and left the building. Employees whispered theories: merger stress, personal problems, health issues, substance abuse, each rumor more dramatic than the last. I suspected the truth was both simpler and more damning. The audit was getting too close to his fraud. The breaking point came during week 4. The audit team requested a meeting with the executive team to discuss significant inconsistencies in our financial reporting. The conference room filled with nervous energy. Board members attended remotely. Legal counsel sat in the corner taking notes. I was included as the finance department representative since Marcus called in sick. Richard opened with diplomacy. We appreciate your cooperation throughout this process. However, we have identified issues that must be resolved before we can proceed. He presented a detailed analysis of our financial statements. There is a pattern of discrepancies between reported figures and supporting documentation. Most concerning are executive expenses that lack proper substantiation. Brandon interrupted. This is ridiculous. We provided everything you requested. If your team cannot properly analyze standard financial documents, perhaps Innosphere should reconsider whether you are qualified to handle this merger. Richard remained composed. Mr. Wells, with all due respect, these are not analysis errors. These are fundamental documentation inconsistencies. Brandon stood his chair, screeching against the floor. This is 1950s accounting, he shouted. Nickel and diming expense reports, while we are building a market-leading enterprise. His face had turned scarlet. If you cannot balance these books, the problem is your outdated methods, not our modern business practices. The room fell silent. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances on the video conference. The legal counsel wrote furiously. Richard straightened his papers calmly, which somehow made Brandon appear more unhinged by contrast. Perhaps Richard said quietly, we should consult with your controller for clarification on these specific items. All eyes turned to me. Brandon smiled tightly. Yes, our controller can clear this up. Coco has managed our books for years. She can explain our perfectly legitimate accounting practices. My heart pounded. This was the moment of choice. The evidence I had gathered independently. The pattern of fraud I had documented. The lies I had observed. I could confirm the audit findings and face Brandon's wrath, or I could support the official narrative and become complicit. Richard showed me a spreadsheet of the executive lunch expenses, the same pattern I had identified in my late-night investigation. Miss Parker, can you explain these transactions? They do not follow standard expense patterns. I took a deep breath. Check the lunch receipts, I said quietly. The room went still. Excuse me, Richard leaned forward. The lunch receipts, I repeated more firmly. If you examine them closely, you will notice they are all round numbers, always even hundreds or thousands. No actual restaurant bill ever totals exactly $500 or $1,000 after tax and tip. Additionally, many receipts show lunches supposedly occurring when the executives were documented elsewhere. Richard quickly flipped through his folder, pulling out specific documents. He studied them intensely, then grabbed a napkin from the coffee service. He performed calculations, circling a final figure. Without speaking, he slid the napkin across to Brandon. The room watched as Brandon read whatever Richard had written. His face drained of color. His hand began to shake visibly. The napkin fluttered from his fingers to the table. This is absurd, he whispered, but the confidence had vanished from his voice. Richard turned to me. Miss Parker, are you suggesting these expense reports were falsified? Before I could respond, Brandon interjected. Coco is clearly confused. She has been under tremendous stress with this merger. Perhaps she should take some personal time. I am not confused. I stated, my voice stronger than I felt. For the past month, I have independently verified these patterns. Executive expenses, primarily lunches, have been systematically falsified and miscategorized to funnel company funds for personal use. Marcus chose that moment to enter the room, apparently recovered from his illness. His face fell as he registered the tension. What did I miss? Your controller is making outrageous accusations about our expense management, Brandon said, attempting to regain control. Richard remained focused on me. Do you have documentation of your findings? I nodded. Extensive documentation. The pattern goes back at least 3 years. Conservative estimates suggest misappropriation exceeding $2 million. Brandon slammed his hand on the table. This is insubordination. Coco is attempting to sabotage this merger because she fears organizational changes. He pointed at me. She has access to our financial systems. If there are irregularities, she created them. Marcus attempted damage control. Perhaps we should discuss this privately before making accusations that could harm the company. Richard shook his head. These findings align with our independent analysis. We have already identified similar patterns. Brandon made one final desperate attempt. This is a simple misunderstanding. Our expense protocols are different from standard practice due to our unique business model. Eleanor Fitzgerald, who had been silent until now, stood up from her seat at the conference table. I think we have heard enough, Brandon. Her voice carried the weight of decades of business experience. Security will escort you and Marcus to collect your personal belongings. Do not access any company systems or remove any company property. Brandon stared at her in disbelief. After everything I have given this company, this is how you repay me. I couldn't help myself. You gave me the truth to find, I said quietly, and I found it. Security appeared at the door. Brandon and Marcus were led away, their access badges confiscated. The merger meeting adjourned, as the board called an emergency session, and I sat motionless, trying to process what had just happened and what would come next. The emergency board meeting lasted until late evening. I spent hours with Richard and his team, walking them through my findings in detail. I provided my spreadsheets, timelines, and analysis. With each revelation, their expressions grew more serious. You identified this independently, Richard asked, reviewing my documentation. I noticed discrepancies during preparation for your audit, I explained. The patterns became clear once I started looking specifically at executive expenses. Why didn't you report this to the board immediately? I hesitated. I needed to be certain. Brandon had powerful allies. Making accusations without irrefutable evidence would have ended my career. Eleanor nodded from across the table. She made the right call. Brandon would have buried her in the evidence if she had shown her hand too early. The forensic details painted a sophisticated scheme. Brandon and Marcus had created a system where fake business lunches served as vehicles to extract company funds. The money moved through expense accounts then to vendors who provided kickbacks. Simple enough to execute with the CFO's cooperation, complex enough to hide within thousands of legitimate transactions. Meanwhile, employees gathered at windows overlooking the executive floor watching the drama unfold. Security escorted Brandon and Marcus to their offices to collect personal items, then to the elevators and out of the building. HR deactivated their accounts and changed security protocols. The executive team huddled in smaller groups, faces grim as they processed the implications. By evening, the initial shock gave way to practical concerns. The merger hung in balance. Leadership positions sat empty. Financial statements required review for accuracy. The board appointed Eleanor as interim CEO and asked me to work with the audit team to assess the full damage. "You understand this will be difficult," Eleanor told me privately. "Some will view you as disloyal for exposing this fraud. Others will question why you didn't catch it sooner. Your integrity will be questioned either way." I nodded. "I understand." But I could not remain silent once I knew. "Good," she said firmly. "That is exactly why you are the right person to help us rebuild trust." The following days were a whirlwind. Forensic accountants arrived to work alongside our team and the auditors. We pulled financial records going back 5 years. We reviewed every executive expense, every vendor payment, every revenue recognition decision. The pattern of fraud extended further than I initially discovered. Brandon had maintained offshore accounts where company funds were diverted. Marcus had created false vendors who billed for non-existent services. 2 other executives had participated in smaller schemes, accepting improper payments or benefits. The total exceeded $5 million over 5 years. Legal teams prepared for potential criminal charges. The SEC opened an investigation into financial reporting practices. Internal and external communications teams crafted statements for employees, clients, and shareholders. The company entered crisis management mode with daily briefings and constant strategy adjustments. Throughout this period, I operated on autopilot. 12-hour days became normal. Meals at my desk, constant meetings, endless questions. My apartment became my only refuge, though. Even there, I found myself reviewing documents until exhaustion claimed me. My colleagues reacted differently to my role in exposing the fraud. Some treated me as a hero, bringing coffee or offering encouragement. Others avoided me completely, as if whistleblowing might be contagious. Most seemed uncertain how to act, their behavior awkwardly formal when once it had been casual. Journalists began calling, seeking interviews or comments. PR instructed me to direct all inquiries to the communications department. Social media buzzed with speculation, some casting me as a corporate hero, others as a naive pawn in boardroom politics. I avoided all platforms, unwilling to see my professional life dissected by strangers. The strain manifested physically. I lost weight. Dark circles appeared beneath my eyes. My normally neat appearance became hastily assembled. Heather noticed and insisted on regular check-ins. "You exposed the fraud," she reminded me. "You do not need to single-handedly fix it too." While I struggled personally, the professional consequences unfolded with surprising speed. The merger paused, but did not collapse. Inosphere expressed continued interest once the financial irregularities were addressed. Their CEO made a public statement supporting Techvision's commitment to transparency and appropriate accountability measures. The board appointed an interim CFO from outside the company, someone with a reputation for ethical leadership and financial discipline. To my shock, they asked me to serve as acting CFO until a permanent replacement could be found. The promotion felt simultaneously validating and overwhelming. "We need someone who understands our systems and has demonstrated unquestionable integrity," Eleanor explained when offering the position. "You are the obvious choice." I requested time to consider. The role represented career advancement beyond my expectations, but also tremendous responsibility during a crisis period. Could I rebuild financial credibility? Did I want that burden? What if I failed? Innosphere's audit team, particularly Richard, treated me with newfound respect. During a joint working session, he acknowledged what few others had. "What you did took tremendous courage," he said during a coffee break. "Many in your position would have looked the other way, or convinced themselves it wasn't their problem." I shrugged uncomfortably. "I just followed the numbers." "No," he corrected. "Many people see financial irregularities and rationalize them away. You saw them and pursued the truth regardless of personal consequences. That is rare." His words should have been comforting, but instead triggered my own doubts. Had I done the right thing? The company faced public scrutiny, employees feared for their jobs, and the merger hung in balance. Would silence have been better for everyone? The question haunted me during sleepless nights. Heather became my emotional anchor. "You did not create this situation," she reminded me during our regular check-ins. "Brandon and Marcus did. They betrayed their fiduciary duties and the trust of every employee. The consequences flow from their actions, not your discovery of them." Logically, I knew she was right. Emotionally, the burden remained heavy. But gradually, as weeks passed and new leadership stabilized the company, I began to find moments of peace. The first night I slept, uninterrupted, felt like a small victory. The first weekend I didn't check email constantly, another. Slowly, I began to recognize my own courage in what I had done. The immediate fallout extended beyond Brandon and Marcus. Security escorted them from the building that afternoon, their personal items shipped later to their homes. Emergency board meetings continued for days, some running past midnight. Employees watched through glass walls as executives and lawyers moved between conference rooms, their expressions grave. Rumors spread throughout the company. Some claimed Brandon had stolen tens of millions. Others suggested the entire merger had been fraudulent from the beginning. A few even speculated that I had orchestrated a coup to seize control. Human nature abhors information vacuums, filling them with increasingly dramatic narratives. I spent those initial days sequestered with auditors, board members, and legal counsel. Hour after hour explaining financial structures, identifying suspicious transactions, and reconstructing the fraud timeline. My detailed spreadsheets became central evidence. My late-night investigation transformed from potential career suicide to corporate salvation. "When did you first suspect financial irregularities?" board members asked repeatedly. "I had vague concerns before the merger announcement," I explained. "But concrete suspicions only formed during the audit process, when patterns became clear." "Why didn't you report earlier?" they pressed. I needed irrefutable evidence. Accusations against the CEO and CFO required absolute certainty. Most accepted this explanation. A few viewed my caution as complicity. The line between appropriate diligence and delayed reporting proved razor-thin in hindsight. The investigation expanded rapidly. Forensic accountants from an outside firm arrived, setting up in our largest conference room. They brought specialized software to analyze transaction patterns and identify anomalies. I worked alongside them, explaining our financial systems and providing context for their findings. "This is sophisticated for an expense fraud," the lead forensic accountant commented. "They created an entire ecosystem of fake vendors and reciprocal payments." Together, we uncovered offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands linked to shell companies Brandon controlled. We found property purchases made through intermediaries, but ultimately benefiting Marcus. We discovered other executives receiving improper benefits, from subsidized personal travel to undisclosed compensation. The total fraud exceeded $5 million, spread across dozens of schemes. The legal implications mounted daily. Our general counsel coordinated with outside criminal attorneys. The SEC launched a formal investigation into our financial reporting. Shareholder lawsuits appeared inevitable. Criminal charges against Brandon and Marcus became increasingly likely as evidence accumulated. Throughout this period, I experienced emotional whiplash unlike anything in my professional life. Colleagues either avoided eye contact in hallways or treated me with uncomfortable deference. "There goes the whistleblower," I overheard once in the break room, the tone making it unclear whether this was compliment or criticism. Journalists contacted me directly, having obtained my personal email and phone number. "We want to tell your story," they insisted. The accountant who brought down a corrupt CEO. I declined all interviews, forwarding their information to our communications team. My apartment, once a peaceful refuge, became cluttered with financial documents and legal papers I brought home for review. Takeout containers accumulated as cooking became impossible to fit into 18-hour days. Sleep came in irregular bursts, often at my desk rather than my bed. The physical toll matched the emotional strain. The professional consequences continued unfolding. The merger paused rather than collapsed entirely. Inosphere expressed continued interest, but required completely revised financial statements and new leadership before proceeding. Their CEO made diplomatic public statements about supporting Techvision through this transition period, while privately demanding extensive changes. Eleanor called me to her office one afternoon during the second week of investigations. The board has appointed an interim CEO, she explained. Adrian Lawrence from our industry advisory board. He has extensive turnaround experience. I nodded, having anticipated this development. Eleanor continued. We also need an interim CFO. Someone with detailed knowledge of our systems but unquestionable integrity. She looked at me pointedly. The board would like you to step into that role temporarily. The offer stunned me. I am a controller, not a CFO. There must be more qualified candidates. There are more experienced candidates, Eleanor corrected. None with your combination of company knowledge and demonstrated ethical courage. You found this fraud when others ignored or participated in it. That makes you uniquely qualified to help rebuild trust. I requested time to consider, overwhelmed by the opportunity, but equally daunted by the responsibility. CFO represented a major career advancement, but accepting meant leading financial reconstruction during our most challenging period. Could I handle the pressure? Did I even want to try? Discussions with Inosphere continued despite the turmoil. I attended meetings as the financial representative, explaining our remediation efforts and answering their increasingly detailed questions. Richard Thompson, once an adversary, became an unexpected ally, acknowledging the difficulty of my position. Most people who expose corporate fraud end up leaving their companies, he noted during one break. The whistleblower becomes a constant reminder of institutional failure. You are in an unusual position, helping rebuild what you helped expose. His observation crystallized my discomfort. I had neither fully embraced hero status nor accepted villain designation. I existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, simultaneously celebrated for integrity and resented for disruption. Each day brought moments where I questioned my decisions, wondering whether silence might have been easier for everyone. You need to stop torturing yourself, Heather advised during one of our regular coffee meetings. Brandon created this situation, not you. His actions forced your choice. You chose integrity over complicity. Never apologize for that. Logically, I understood her perspective. Emotionally reconciling my role proved more difficult. I found myself replaying conversations, wondering if I could have addressed the fraud differently. Perhaps confronted Brandon privately first, reported to the board earlier. Each alternative carried its own risks and ethical complications. The personal strain continued. My parents called more frequently, concerned about news stories, mentioning financial irregularities at Techvision. I provided minimal details, unwilling to burden them with the full complexity. Friends invited me to dinners I was too exhausted to attend. My world contracted to work-home and the increasingly blurred boundary between them. By the fourth week, physical exhaustion forced lifestyle changes. I established firmer boundaries around work hours. I scheduled actual lunch breaks away from my desk. I declined non-essential meetings. Small adjustments that helped restore basic functioning. The first full night of sleep came like a revelation, reminding me what normal once felt like. As the initial crisis phase stabilized, I made my decision about the CFO position. I accepted the interim role with specific conditions, a clear timeline, additional support staff, and explicit board backing for financial system reforms. Eleanor agreed immediately, seeming relieved by my acceptance. You were always the right choice, she said. You just needed to believe it yourself. I met with the Inosphere team to rebuild trust and restart merger discussions. To my surprise, they expressed respect rather than resentment for the disruption. Your company demonstrated that it values integrity over expediency, their CEO commented. That makes you a better partner, not a worse one. The merger timeline adjusted rather than abandoned. Financial restatements would delay closing by approximately 6 months. Integration planning continued, with revised leadership teams. The fundamental business logic remained sound even as the execution changed significantly. As weeks turned to months, I gradually recognized the positive impacts emerging from the crisis. Financial controls strengthened. Reporting transparency increased. Ethical considerations entered decision-making processes more prominently. The culture shifted subtly towards substance over appearance. None of these changes erased the damage done, but they created foundation for rebuilding. 6 months after that dramatic confrontation in the conference room, Techvision operated under transformed leadership. Adrian Lawrence had transitioned from interim to permanent CEO, bringing steady governance after the chaotic Brandon era. I had accepted the permanent CFO position after successfully leading financial reconstruction during the crisis period. The merger with Innosphere finally closed, albeit on adjusted terms reflecting our financial restatements. The combined company emerged stronger than either individual organization with complementary products and expanded market reach. Our stock price, after initially plummeting when the fraud became public, gradually recovered and eventually exceeded previous levels. Most importantly, the company culture fundamentally changed. Transparency replaced obfuscation as our operating principle. Ethics discussions became regular features of leadership meetings. Financial controls tightened across all departments. Brandon's appearance over substance approach gave way to Adrian's emphasis on sustainable growth and legitimate reporting. Brandon himself awaited trial on multiple fraud charges. The SEC investigation expanded to include securities violations and misleading investor statements. Marcus accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against his former boss. Several other executives received lesser penalties for their roles in the schemes. The legal proceedings would continue for years, but accountability had begun. My professional transformation proved equally significant. Once the quiet controller who avoided politics, I now spoke confidently in board meetings and executive sessions. My presentations emphasized ethical considerations alongside financial metrics. When questionable proposals emerged, I raised concerns directly, rather than remaining silent. My reputation for integrity became my greatest professional asset. "You've changed," Heather observed during lunch one day. "Not just your title, your presence. You own your authority now." She was right. I had discovered strength I never knew I possessed. The crisis forced me to overcome natural caution and find my voice. That voice grew stronger with each challenge faced and overcome. I declined numerous job offers from competitors and consulting firms eager to hire the ethical whistleblower CFO. Despite attractive compensation packages, I remained committed to completing Techvision's transformation. The project felt personal, a mission beyond career advancement. I needed to see it through. I began mentoring junior finance staff, emphasizing both technical skills and ethical judgment. Numbers tell stories, I explained during training sessions. Our responsibility is ensuring those stories reflect truth, not convenient fictions. Watching young accountants embrace this philosophy became unexpectedly rewarding. Industry recognition followed. The Association of Corporate Financial Officers invited me to present at their annual conference. My session, Ethics as Competitive Advantage Lessons from Financial Fraud Recovery, drew standing room attendance. Business schools requested guest lectures. Professional journals solicited articles. The platform expanded beyond anything I had imagined for my career. The personal healing journey proved more challenging than professional advancement. For months after the revelation, I struggled with anxiety and second-guessing. Should I have acted sooner? Could I have prevented more damage? Was exposing the fraud worth the organizational trauma? These questions haunted quiet moments. Recognizing the toll, I began working with a therapist specializing in workplace trauma. Our sessions helped process the emotional aftermath of whistleblowing. Gradually, I developed healthier perspectives on my role in both exposing and remediating the fraud. Self-forgiveness came slowly but steadily. Relationships with colleagues evolved through distinct phases. Initial awkwardness gave way to cautious respect, eventually transforming into genuine appreciation. Team members who initially avoided me later admitted their avoidance stemmed from guilt over their own silence, rather than judgment of my actions. These conversations, though difficult, helped rebuild trust throughout the organization. 6 months after the merger completion, Richard Thompson's audit team returned for our first combined company review. During a dinner celebrating successful completion, Richard raised his glass. To Coco Parker, he said, whose courage transformed a routine audit into a masterclass in corporate integrity. My face warmed with embarrassment at the public acknowledgement, but something else accompanied the discomfort. Pride. Not arrogance, but quiet satisfaction in having done the right thing despite personal risk. That feeling, once foreign, now felt increasingly familiar. Eleanor Fitzgerald, who remained on our board after stepping down as interim CEO, offered ongoing mentorship. Your technical skills were always impressive, she told me during one of our monthly meetings. Now your leadership matches them. You have rare combination of competence and character. That makes you dangerous to the Brandon Welleses of the business world. I laughed at her characterization but recognized the underlying truth. I had crossed an invisible threshold from implementing systems to shaping them, from following protocols to establishing them, from detecting problems to preventing them. The transformation expanded my vision of my own capabilities and potential impact. The merger celebration took place exactly 1 year after Brandon's fraud exposure. Hundreds of employees from both original companies gathered at a downtown hotel ballroom. Adrian Lawrence delivered the keynote address, emphasizing themes of integrity and sustainable growth. Then, unexpectedly, he called me to the stage. Standing before colleagues, many still strangers from the inosphere side, I felt momentary panic. Public speaking remained uncomfortable despite my increased confidence in smaller settings. But something shifted as I looked across the audience. These people deserved honesty after experiencing corporate betrayal. A year ago, I faced the most difficult professional decision of my life. I began. Expose financial fraud committed by our most senior executives, or remain silent to protect my career. In that moment, I learned something essential about myself and about business. Integrity is not a luxury or a marketing slogan. It is the foundation everything else builds upon. The room fell silent, hundreds of faces focused intently. I continued. Our combined company stands on that foundation now, not because of any single person's actions, but because collectively we chose truth over convenience, sustainability over short-term gains, reality over appealing fiction. That choice, made daily in large and small ways, defines who we are and what we will become. The applause that followed caught me by surprise, as did the standing ovation, not just polite acknowledgement but genuine appreciation. Eleanor beamed from her table near the front. Heather wiped away unexpected tears. Richard nodded approvingly from the back. These moments of recognition, once uncomfortable, now felt like appropriate milestones in a journey still unfolding. Later that evening, Eleanor approached with champagne flutes for both of us. I have watched many corporate crises across my career, she said. Most companies never fully recover. The damage becomes a permanent part of their identity. She clinked her glass against mine. You helped create a different outcome. You turned ethical crisis into ethical transformation. That is remarkable. Her words crystallized what I had begun to understand intuitively. My journey from quiet controller to CFO represented more than career advancement. It embodied the possibility of corporate redemption through individual courage. The willingness to stand alone when necessary, to speak truth when easier options presented themselves, to value integrity above advancement. The fraud had been sophisticated but ultimately discoverable because numbers never truly lie. They may be manipulated, misrepresented, or disguised, but eventually patterns emerge that reveal underlying truth. My commitment to finding those patterns, regardless of who created them, had transformed both my company and myself. As I look back now, I realize how unexpected my path has been. I never sought to become a whistleblower or an ethical standard bearer. I simply followed numbers to their logical conclusion, refusing to accept convenient falsehoods along the way. That persistence, more than any technical skill, defined my professional journey. Have you ever faced a situation where doing the right thing seemed harder than staying silent? What gave you the courage to speak up? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more experiences about standing up for truth even when it feels impossible. Remember, integrity isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small choices we make every day when no one is watching. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I hope it inspires you to trust your instincts when something doesn't add up in your own life.